But yeah, there are a lot of crimes that happen at Yale, but I think if you're like an average, working class or middle class Yale student, the crimes that you do are really generic, right? Like you might take some drugs, you might sell some drugs, and if you're feeling really zany, you might pull a fire alarm. Very general crimes. But some of the most well-known and iconic crimes from Yale University actually come from our alumni. And some of those include the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Very prominent Yale crime. And then in Dick Cheney's case, just shooting a man in the face. So as I said, I grew up in the suburbs, but my parents, they grew up in Spanish Harlem. So they moved from a place that had so much like wealth and culture and like great things to do. And then they moved up north to have me. So they moved from like Harlem, Spanish Harlem, has like the Harlem Renaissance, all of that, to a town that only had 3 things, right? It had a Chili's, it had a lake, and it had an opiate epidemic. All it had. But they sacrificed so much to bring me there. Like they like saved up all this money to have a house. They moved to my like town specifically because it was known to have a good school district. They didn't know about the drugs. It was sad about the drugs because I was like, Mom, all of these drugs would be cheaper if I just bought them off your brother, but that's okay. This white dude with dreads is ripping me off these drugs. That's okay.
I'd love to talk about black scent. I'm just very curious, like, can a white comedian use black scent in their humor, or is that going to be inauthentic and it not get the jokes because it's imitative rather than true because they don't actually know the language?
Yeah. Usually when they do it, they're being annoying. In my view, I've probably seen it. I haven't been at an open mic in quite some time, but I've probably seen it. You have to write a very good joke to get away with using a black scent, and probably if the joke is that good, you probably did not need to use the black scent in the first place if you are a white comedian. Yeah. I mean, even with like how I speak is like not like stereotypically what people think of when they think of a black person, and I don't try to switch, and when I like write stuff, I don't really switch into like heavy AAVE, like, stereotype, like, I don't know, like Wayne's brother movie black woman voice.
Oh, girl.
Yeah, like, excuse me, girl, like, where are you, so because it's just like, that's not how I talk. Like, if I don't know, it's, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And so I shared a video before from a YouTuber. I think her name is T Noir, and she talks about the blacks and how a lot of YouTubers and I think a lot of TikTokers as well have sort of gotten a lot of fame from being able to leverage the sort of like this part of their personality. So everything else they do is like very like plain Jane, like white girl or white guy or whatever, a white person, I should say. And then, out of nowhere, they like, bust out with some like, oh, and she was throwing shade and like, honey girl, like don't come for my wig and this and that. And you see the sort of backlash across the internet, like, teaching white people about pick-me's was the worst decision ever. It's like a Facebook group that exists. You see all these people like, when did white people learn our lingo? Like that was something that we kind of had. And then it was something that we sort of shared with white people who were who we invited into the in crowd. So we have the saying, it's like a internet saying, I guess, but like inviting certain white people to the picnic, quote unquote. And so I think that there are certain white people who, for whatever reason, Black people have developed a certain level of comfort around, or people think, oh, you get it. And I think they are able to sort of get away more with this. So I'm thinking of like Tim Wise, who's like a very famous anti-racist educator. Like you can tell he spent a lot of time with like Southern Black ladies and people who like, and like preachers and like Black people who have like distinctive speech patterns where when he uses it, like the way it comes, I think for people who didn't know him, it could rub them the wrong way because like, that's not how they traditionally think of. That's how like a white person should talk. But for people who are in that crowd, they can sort of appreciate like they and as something that is like a part of him now, maybe. But I can understand why people wouldn't like that. But then you have people who like don't have any Black friends, never like don't care about any Black issues, but just think that the lingo is cool. But like we like vote for Trump in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
Like all of these things, and then they get to like seem cool because, you know, they know some slang and maybe they have some Black friends. And then they feel like they can say the N-word. And then it just goes like
it keeps going, yeah.
It tends to keep going. And so a question I have is, you know, is blackface only blackface? Like, do you have to paint the skin, or are there other forms that, you know, maybe aren't as like in your face, but like a black scent? Or I saw one article that talked about digital blackface of white people using either emojis that have like the black fist, for example, instead of using one that aligns to their skin tone, or using like a Nene Leaks, or like any number of Black people. Like, I think Black people make up a lot of memes just in general, but using those memes as a non-Black person to like accentuate, you know, your points, or like be more humorous. And so I wonder, like, is it appropriation?
I think that's like when you consciously have to switch it on. You know what I mean? Like, going back to esoteric, like when you have to say, okay, now I'm doing this, instead of just doing it. I think that is that line, right?
But is that necessary? Does that necessarily, though, make the people racist? Does it necessarily make them bad? Or is that a person's attempt to try and understand and connect? Like, sort of like when somebody comes in and they're from France and you say, oh, bonjour, you know, and that's the only word you know in French, and you just say it, and you don't know anything else. And that's your way of sort of like connecting and kind of being cool when you're in France, you know, do like the Parisians say, and you go to Target, like all this, but it's not meant as a way to be nasty. Like, is there a space for that? Or
but I mean, if you constantly have to switch it on, like you, say,
right, you are.
Okay, now I'm going to do this because this person is here. Like, if you consciously have to switch it on, like you should be like saying, okay, let me step back. Is this rude? Like, I know. Are you saying it like a joke? Are you saying it sarcastically? Are you coming up? Is a French person coming up?
Polar? How? Like literally, like this is like Latinos have to deal with. Like, como estas? Like,
I think regardless of whether the individual that kind of like fakes a black scent is like may have racist ideals or not, it's a consequence of living in a culture that has predominantly seen Black people as like a source of entertainment as opposed to living beings. And if that person actually cared about Black people, then you'd be able to take them aside and be like, hey, I've noticed you do this. Like, just think about it a little bit more and maybe stop it. And then they like stop it, you know? But there's a lot of people where I think they'd be like, oh, I could talk like however, like Black people talk like this and whatever. And I think part of it is like Black people, like Black people make a lot of jokes on the internet. I mean, everyone makes a lot of jokes on the internet, but like now the internet isn't a segregated space, right? Like now if I make a joke online about Black people, everyone could see it, right? And Black Twitter is hilarious. They make a lot of great jokes, but I think some people are like, oh, this is on Twitter, like, you know, this is just a thing that people say to be funny, as opposed to being like, no, this is specifically AAVE.
So no real
and you could make the same joke not saying it like that.
Okay, so then, Seanna, I have a question for you. At the top of the hour, like when our podcast starts, you always say aloha. Oh, I'm not exactly.
Aloha mai kako.
Aloha mai. Okay, I don't have it yet, but let's say I had it and I finally figured it out, right? And because I'm thinking all this time, my God, it's so cool that she says that. And then like you're always wearing, like I'm just telling you what I'm thinking. You're wearing like summer clothes and you've got the sun coming out the window behind you and you're going aloha. What's the word?
Aloha mai kako.
Aloha mai kako.
Aloha mai. Aloha mai kako.
Aloha mai kako. So after a while, I'm like, cool. And someone walks in and I'm like, oh, aloha mai kako. And they're like, what? And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's high in Hawaiian. And I start saying it around here. Is that cool or is that not cool? Because clearly I'm going to be saying it wrong. I'm going to have the accent in the wrong place. I'm going to say the whole thing messed up. Is that a bad thing? And if I were a comedian and I start my skit like that, would that be offensive?
I mean, if you contextualize, like here in Hawaii, people say that all the time, even if they're non-Hawaiian. It's just like a saying you say. It's what you do. Like, hello, everyone. Like the Hawaiian language there's the pidgin accent where it blends Hawaiian language with English and Chinese and Filipino, and like it all blends together. And so you don't have to be native Hawaiian to say aloha. It's like what it is. And I say that because that's like my culture. I'm saying I think it would be cool if you contextualized it, saying like, oh, I learned this new word today, or I learned this new phrase today. That's cool.
Could a comedian say that? Is that cool? Or if a white comedian is saying something that is black accent, like some phrase.
Yeah. I mean, if a white comedian who had no connection to Hawaii, did not grow up in Hawaii, has no like Hawaiian friends or whatever, randomly said, "Hello, everyone," in Hawaiian on stage, my first thought would be like, why are they saying that? You know? And I don't think that's like a wrong thought to have. It's like, why are you trying to be cool? And I know a few white comedians from Hawaii, or I've like not know personally, but I've seen a few white comedians from Hawaii. One thing they always say is like, I say Hawaii different because I grew up there. So they say Hawaii instead of Hawaii. And like, they'll like mention it, but they like make it clear, like, yeah, I'm a white person from Hawaii. I don't think they're trying to be like, oh, I'm cooler than I am because I say aloha, et cetera, et cetera. I also don't know Hawaiian. But it's like, it's like how it would come off as inauthentic. I think if I said it, it would also come off as inauthentic. Like, I've never been to Hawaii. Why would I say it, you know?
Well, a couple of things, though. I think there's a difference between, like, a word that, like, it just stands alone, that is, like, you know, it's a word in a foreign language. And so I think it would be people in other cultures and other countries appreciate when you're a guest there and you try to like learn the language and you try to pronounce things right. I think that's an excellent example of cultural appreciation. But, you know, if you are, you know, if you're not in that context and you are, you know, using maybe something that isn't so universal in a culture, but something that is more specific and more like something that's more closely like talking about something like slavery, like talking about like certain topics, or, you know, even like wearing, you know, traditional native headdresses, like these things like mean something like more within a culture that like you have to be careful. And like you can't just, you know, as a white person feel like you're entitled to, you know, jump out and do because you can.
I think authenticity, I want to go back to authenticity. Like, for example, you know, in Native cultures, I've seen it like Blackfeet, and I've seen it in Native Hawaiian. And when I talk to others, it's this idea of humility, right? If you're a guest, if you are coming into a space, you're meant to be humble and quiet. And the idea is don't pretend to be something you are not. Because if you pretend to be something that you're not humble. So how can we trust you coming into this space if you're putting on a show, right? So, and that comes over to me because, Kendra, what you were talking about with like accents, right? I have a Valley Girl accent. I know this for a fact. I have family that have like different accents. For example, my grandfather speaks Pidgin. Like he doesn't, it's a Creole language here in Hawaii. And so his predominant language is Pidgin. And so I have to sit there and talk to him. And sometimes I don't understand what he's saying because it comes from plantation days. Like it got passed down in his family from plantation days. And some people try to mock the accent here. They're like, oh, this is what's gonna, and that movie Ohana on Netflix, they mock the Pidgin language, right? They make it a joke when it's like, but why are you making it a joke? Are you making it a joke because you are Hawaiian and you're talking to your grandparent that's speaking Pidgin? And I can sit over here and say, like, sometimes I sit there and I have no idea what he's saying, right? Like, and my grandfather has explicitly told me, he said, don't go into a space, like don't go into like a very rural area where Pidgin is the predominant way of communicating here in Hawaii and start trying to speak Pidgin because you don't know how. You don't have the accent, you don't know how. So just speak who you are and be authentic. You're more likely to be liked by them and trusted by them if you are authentic. So I speak like a Valley Girl accent. Sometimes though the slang comes out because I am familiar with some of the slang, and I can't help it. Like the way that, for example, like sayings like "no need," like I don't need that. You say like "no need." Like there's just tiny little ways that sentences are rearranged. Or like for example, when I go to the reservation, like the Blackfeet and Browning, sometimes I pick up the accent, but not really. Um, I think it's like code switching sometimes as well.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Like, I feel like I've definitely code switched a lot of for a lot of my life, and I've gotten to a point where I had to sort of like make like just like I you know like just be like find one dialect that just fits me at in all spaces, and kind of like fuck it if you don't you don't like how I talk. Like sometimes I'm gonna sound like a quote unquote white girl. And then sometimes I'm going to like I guess like the Philly girl in me is gonna come out, and I'm gonna speak in Ebonics and slang, and because that's I feel like that's also natural to me. And I wondered like would someone think that I'm guilty of it? Because I think that's the way a lot of these white people sort of do. It's not a full code switch though. It's like 90% of everything they say is in like regular like white speak, let's call it. And then like just when they're trying to like do their punchline and they just put this accent on, like would it still be funny if you didn't change your voice and your tone?
Yeah.
And like you changing your voice and your tone is different than me having to like speak a certain way in order to make sure that I can like, get a job or be seen as like valuable in society or intelligent. Whereas like white people can get away with speaking in Ebonics and no one is going to think that they are unintelligent. And so for me, I try to push the envelope more and more as I get older, because I'm like, I have 3 Ivy League degrees. Like, you don't think I'm dumb. So I'm going to talk how I want to talk. And but even still, like I have people like at Decker, one of the people said to me, oh, maybe you don't read as fast. Like,
it's like I have 3 degrees. I had to read for all those goddamn degrees.
No one said maybe you don't read as fast.
Yes.
What?
My God.
That sounds crazy. Wait, but I'm a little bit. I do think a lot of comedians, for their punchlines, take on accents of other cultures and other people. Like they'll sound like an old person from Italy, or they'll sound like a guy from Germany, or they'll take the French accent. So I think like comedy complicates things. Whereas when you're talking in like regular, like between people and in conversation, I see the difference between appreciation versus appropriation and being your authentic self, right? And not pretending. And like, I think about that. That's a good lesson for everyone to have. Like, be who you are and be respectful. But I think comedy just blurs it in a way that complicates matters a little bit.
Well, I think so. I think it's.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. So it is. I would say it's still different. Like the difference between. So there's a comedian, Maria Bamford. I'll type her in. She does a lot of voices in her act, but none of her voices are like ethnic or like whatever voices. It's like her imitating her mom or her dad or like her husband or a young kid. Like none of them are like generic Italian man, generic Indian. Right. So that's an example of like you using voices without it being like an ethnic or racial stereotype. I would also say, like, I know there's also comedians where, they'll impersonate their parents. Like if you're like a comedian who like is an immigrant, like there was one comedian I saw, I think she was like Arab American or like Palestinian American, and she imitated her parents. And like, that's not, I know you're not imitating your parents, or like, depending on the joke, not necessarily I know, but I know there's a higher likelihood that you're imitating your parents, not out of like racism or like an effect, right? But like I would say there's a lot, like if you are a white guy trying to impersonate like a taxi driver who is not white, like has an accent, you need to think about like what the accent is doing in that like joke, like especially if it's stand-up, because like obviously if it's television, you're supposed to hire someone from that culture to say the lines, but you need to think about like what the accent is doing for that joke, and like what, like, are their lines funny without the accent? Like, are you trying to do it for like authenticity? Which is like, I like, I don't do a lot of voices in my act. I think that's just me. I'm not good at, like, I'm still learning my, like, act, not voice. Yeah, I guess, like, I'm still learning my, like, impression skills or whatever. But it's like, could you say, could that still be a joke without you, like, being like, it's funny because he's Indian, you know?
But Kendra, as a comedian, would you say that comedians should stay away from cultural impressionism as a way of doing their comedy?
Yeah, I think not even beyond, I would say so, even beyond the, like, you know, like, it's not fun. It's not good to imitate people of different races just because they're that race. I think it's also kind of like tired. The comedy world had Russell Peters, like, 20 years ago, where, like, all of his impressions were like, oh, you know, like, this is how Indian people beat their kids, and here's how Mexican people beat. And I think, like, they're just kind of tired of it. Or, like, I think it's a little hackneyed. So you, like, you know, you should probably stay away from non-white in person. Like, of course, if you imitate a French person, it's like, French people aren't oppressed. They, like, colonized half of the fucking world. Or,
right.
Huh?
No,
also, yeah, French people, they sound funny too. It's like, yeah. Also, yeah, where the French were in Iran, like, it'd be like anti-colonialism if you made fun of French people, or, like, you know.
And that's the difference.
Yes, that's the difference. Whereas, like, if you imitate an Asian person, like, right now, in the wake of all these anti-Asian attacks, because people think that all Asian Americans here somehow have COVID for some reason, even though, you know, we're like 11 months in this, then that's, like, contributing to a culture of, like, you know, attacking Asian people, or, you know, making fun of Asian people.
Or, you know, or if you're someone, to take it back to the beginning, like, if you're Stephen Colbert, like, putting out the ching chong dong, like, that kind of, like, makes it okay to, like, I thought we were getting away from ching chong dong, right? Like,
yeah. But I feel like that where that joke failed was that, like, I mean, it probably would have helped. So Seth Meyers has he has a session or like a part of his show where he's like, here's jokes that Seth Meyers can't tell, but that the writing room wrote, and he'll bring on, like, you know, marginalized people of his writing room. I think, like, one person that did that a lot was Amber Ruffin, who is a Black woman, and then I think there was, like, a Puerto Rican lesbian, and they'll say jokes that they know are funny, but would not be funny coming out of Seth Meyers' mouth because he's a white person. So I feel like if Stephen Colbert had an Asian person, which, like, I know The Daily Show does have an Asian writer on now, or, like, Asian, like, correspondent who, like, says jokes. I feel like if that person said the joke or, like, made the comparison, there would not be as much of an uproar, right? So it's, like, small things like that where it's like, okay, like, here's how I get my Twitter mentions clearer for this entire week while spotlighting someone on the writer room that may not have gotten a lot of attention otherwise. Will said one of the gags on SNL is when Michael Che writes.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. I was gonna bring that up. Yeah.
By the way, I feel uncomfortable with that. I
don't watch SNL, which I know is, like, a funny.
It's hilarious, but I always feel uncomfortable. I'm like, how is this racist joke okay just because it's coming out of a Black guy's mouth? Every time I see that skit, I'm like, oh, I don't know if I really like this.
But
again, I don't watch SNL. I don't know what happens on that show.
You know what I mean? Like, does the joke always have to be for you? I think, like, when you feel uncomfortable because a Black person or, like, a Native person is saying a Native joke, like, I can go into some of these, like,
no, that
joke about
stereotypes. But that particular SNL thing is different.
This
like,
skit, though, it's not intended. I'll introduce it. Okay. This particular skit is, like, literally just, like, the two correspondents for Weekend Update. So you have one white guy, Colin Jost, and one Black guy, Michael Che. And so they do, I mean, SNL is a bunch of satire. Weekend Update is satire, whatever. But they do this one, like, segment where they take turns, like, creating jokes for each other to say. And the whole point is just for them to make each other uncomfortable.
Correct.
So it's not even meant to, like, teach a lesson to the audience or, like, be, like, you know, tell something that makes you think deeply about race. It's, like, literally, like, you know, in the whole, like, the shtick behind it is that they supposedly hadn't seen the jokes before they say them. So lots of times you'll see, especially Colin Jost, the white correspondent, like, struggling to get through
totally see that. Yeah.
the lines, and he's just like, oh my God, I don't want to say this kind of thing. Like, and that's very much a part of why the audience finds it funny, is because like, you know, that these people wouldn't want to say this stuff out loud. And so that makes me kind of look at SNL like, like you really have like a racist joke spot, and like in the way you're able to get away with it, because I agree.
That's what I think. I do not like it. And I'm like, I don't understand why a Black man would agree to this thing. Every time I hear it, I'm like, this whole thing is completely racist. I don't even want my kids listening to this, because these might be stereotypes that they were not even aware of before they heard it, because these two guys are joking about it. Like, I just don't like that skit. And I know I'm supposed to be laughing, and I'm always uncomfortable about it.
But I think that's funny, Haleh, because you like the Dave Chappelle skits. And I feel like those are like super edgy and like, I don't know, maybe I think they're funny. I think they're hilarious.
It's funny, but it's uncomfortable, right? It comes from an uncomfortable space because you have a mixed audience, and it's almost saying like a racist joke is okay because the Black person wrote it for the white guy for it to come out of his mouth. And I'm like, it's still a racist joke.
Sometimes I feel like comedians have to earn my laugh. Like, I don't know about you, but like comedy, I sit there with comedy. I'm like, okay, you got to earn my laugh. Like, is this bullshit? Like,
no, that's like Black audiences, honestly, with any comedian, but especially white comedians. Yeah. Like that's a joke among Black comedians where it's like, you go into a comedy club, and there's a lot of Black people just kind of like kind of being like, oh, like, let this nigga prove that he's funny.
That's facts.
And then like, hopefully you get them to laugh. Like, if you're good, you get them to laugh. If you're not good, then you
don't just laugh just to be nice to the stand-up. Anytime I go to like a live stand-up, I just laugh the whole time. I feel bad for the person if I don't laugh. It's such a hard job.
You shouldn't feel bad. We're used to people not laughing at us.
Do you think that is like the awkward laugh? Do you think like there's some people who do the awkward laugh because they're like, oh, this is uncomfortable and I should laugh because they're out on stage and I feel bad with them. And then there are others it's like, dude, earn my laugh.
There's a laugh I've done where it's laughing at the person because they're doing so bad, but I think that's because I've been doing comedy for a while. But my laughing at the person is usually at a period of otherwise dead silence, and it's usually way louder than like, oh, I laughed because you actually made a funny joke. So it's like dead silence, they do something stupid, and I just cackle because honestly, that is the feedback that makes hopefully you better. If someone laughs at you because you said something, not because you said something so dumb, but if you're like performing so poorly that someone's laughing at you, then that's a sign you should work on your jokes.
That's hilarious.
It's like an immediate censorship, essentially.
I mean, I guess I wouldn't say censorship because technically it's more of like handling the consequences. Technically, you could go on stage at most open mics and say like almost whatever you want, except for like 1% of the edgiest stuff, like, you know, like Hitler stuff, right? If you want people to laugh, you should not say. There are certain things you like shouldn't say, obviously. But like, yeah, we're not censoring you by not laughing. You could still talk, but if your goal is to make people laugh, you're going to need to change what you say. That's like basic rule, you know?
Yeah.
What do you think about the idea that the comedian's job is to sort of give that kind of not cathartic experience, but that experience to like make the audience sort of grapple with their own. Like, do you buy that? Because I've heard comedians say, like, when they make these like awful jokes, their goal is to get the audience to like look at themselves and like, you know, sort of grapple with that in a way that is less, you know, intimidating and less, you know, sort of beat you over the head than like a more like straightforward, like, don't be racist or don't be this. Like, do you think that comedy can actually do the work of anti-racism?
I do.
I think it can. I think in terms of like comedians saying like, oh, we say awful stuff to get you to look inside of your soul. I think it depends on the joke, what their heads. Like, I would say the Gerard Carmichael clip we watched probably has a better chance of doing that as opposed to like a dude being like, you ever think about just like, you know, like saying something really gross and sexual, right? Because there are a lot of, I think it's also like the nature of, you know, patriarchy and racism and stuff, where like a lot of white guys between the ages of 18 and 34 will think some of the things they think in that their experiences are universal, or like some of their thoughts are universal. Yes. And then they say it in front of a microphone, and then half the audience is like, ew, that's disgusting. And then they're like, oh, wait, like, it's not just me. So I think it can, but it really depends on the content of the joke. I think there's also, there's like a little cartoon about this, but I think like there are a lot of comedians that kind of overstate like the idea that they're like fighting for free speech, especially in America, because there are like comedians in like Saudi Arabia and India where they actually have been arrested for their jokes. Has not happened here since like Lenny Bruce, right? Like a comedian is not going to get arrested for their jokes, you know. But like there are some comedians, hashtag not all comedians, who are like, yeah, like we're just the modern day philosophers, and we really gotta keep like pushing the edges. We're supporting like free speech. And then you listen to their stand up, and they're like, hey, you ever have a boner in class? It's like that's not
right.
That's
exactly.
That's not interesting.
I think that's a good segue into the second part of our conversation about like the power of comedy to heal and do some of the anti-racism work. And we can continue on this question because I think it's a good sort of bridge. But I wanted to show you a very short clip. It's only 1 minute and 40 seconds of a Dick Gregory stand-up. So Dick Gregory, God rest his soul, he was a Black stand-up comedian who started like in the early 60s doing stand-up in front of, he started with Black audiences, but he was one of the first to like be able to like do stand-up in front of all white audiences. And he did like he did racial humor, and it very much was like, you know, more akin to Saudi Arabia for him than it is now for you know, comedians. Like for him to be telling some of these jokes on these spaces, he probably was risking his life.
You know, I feel so sorry for Willie. I hate to see any baseball player having troubles. But that's a great sport for my people. That is the only sport in the world where a Negro can shake a stick at a white man and won't start no riot. Of course, now, don't get me wrong now. We're doing all right. Well, at the rate we're going 10 years from now, you might have to be my color to get a job. And let's face it, they're not making man tan for nothing. Keep me right, I'll get in there and raise taxes on you. I mean, now, don't get me wrong. I wouldn't mind paying my income tax if I knew it was going to a friendly country. And we have a lot of racial prejudice up north, but we're so clever with it. Take my hometown, Chicago. I mean, you can't see it just going in there. When the Negroes in Chicago move into one large area and it looked like we might control the votes, they don't say anything to us. They have a slum clearance. You do the same thing on the West Coast, but you call it freeways. Well, anybody here from Chicago? Where do you live in Chicago? South side? Whereabouts? North side? Lawrence, yeah. How long you been away? 7 years. You're in a hell of a surprise if you ever go back. My brother just moved in there.
So that was good because it brought up issues of like redlining. Like, yeah, he like talked about some real stuff in that small clip, and it was still funny.
I think it depends on your intent and your ability to do it, because I do think that comedians can really bring up topics in a way that others can't, and in an accessible way, right? Not everyone can sit down and have that serious conversation, but if you get a truly talented person be able to put this together in a thoughtful way, you really can push the boundaries and encourage people to expand their minds. On the other hand, when it's done poorly, it just becomes an excuse for people to throw out racial slurs or sexist comments without really making people be thoughtful about it. And I think the good ones are the ones you remember, and the bad ones are the ones who really don't make it, you know, for the most part, are not as successful.
Oh, sometimes they still make it, but they pivot their audience. They go on to Stormfront and do some shows, you know.
Now, Seanna, did you have any clips from Native comedians?
I have one that I just want, like, there's humor, I'd like to talk about smoke signals really quickly with
Yeah.
but I want, when we're talking about healing and talking about race and we're talking about like history, historical trauma, I want to share this. This one is really interesting because it talks about why natives talk about race in like very dark humor, and why that makes us crack up. People of color identifying with other people of color at their jokes. Like, for example, I laughed in that last clip about the, neighborhoods redlining and freeways because it's happened to similar situation to my people. And sometimes I can laugh at other people of color tell jokes because there's that commonality. Most of it's commonality of colonialization and racism.
Absolutely.
There's a word, they call us now Native Americans, which is a generic term I never liked. We are older than Americans, so how can we be Native? That's something we are older than.
So yes, I am Native American. I'm indigenous. I'm Aboriginal. I'm sick and tired of all the political correct crap. You just call me Caucasically impaired. Is that better? Does that work?
And we're Eastern tribes. Iroquois Confederacy is the Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, Tuscarora, Mohawk, and Senecas.
My Indian name is Wambli Ohitika. I know, it sounds like my dad just looked into a bowl of alphabet soup.
We shall call him...
Our bylaws of the Iroquois Confederacy is what Franklin and Jefferson lifted to use what they call democracy here. So the idea of democracy, that's not imported, that's indigenous, and that came from us.
When I was in college, I took a Native American Studies class, and I was the only Native American in the class, and I got a C.
We have ancient traditions that we have and still use them, and that's what keeps us strong. But at the same time, we're also modern, contemporary people.
Yeah, that's right. Jewish father, Navajo son. That makes me a bargain hunter-gatherer.
I used to hear when I started, gee, I never heard of a funny Indian before. And the woman that said it, I thought, she doesn't know better. And it's also very funny, but also real sad at the same time.
A lot of Indians, we don't have a lot of body hair. I'm mixed blood, so I got some, it's like patchy, but it's... Can't grow a beard or nothing, man. I tried to grow a goatee once, it just looked like a smiling nutsack.
So you get around Indian people, there's always laughter. Even in times of stress, sorrow, sadness, there's always that undercurrent of humor. And something spiritual, there's always something funny about it because joviality, lightness, laughter. They say laughter is the language of God.
Oh, my great-great-grandmother was a daughter of a Yaqui chief, Standing Deer. My great-great-grandfather was a son of Zapotec leader, Benito Juarez. And because of that mixture of cultures, that intermingling of indigenous bloodlines, I stand here tonight looking like Jackie Chan.
Declaration of Independence, the phrase savage Indian is written in it like 3 or 4 different times. And nobody's ever changed it or addressed it or anything. And so we get people to laugh with us instead of at us. And but we're fighting hundreds of years of stereotypes just by the very act that we're up here.
What did you all think? I'm curious to get your reactions. That was hilarious for me. I almost died.
Well,
Yeah, I thought it was funny.
What I liked most about it was I like how they intertwined the stand-up comedians with the main speaker, like grounding it all in the history to contextualize it. And I think that, it seems like, for the special, like the audience probably we made it mainly Native people, but maybe not. I don't know who all they invited, but it seems like a space for people like of that culture to come together and like commiserate around these like shared experiences.
Yeah.
And so that was like very clear, especially for like how he framed it, like in giving you the history.
Mm-hmm. It's like 6 parts or 5 parts. So that's the intro to a bunch of comedians that come on, and you can find it on YouTube. I think what's interesting in that is there's scenes where they scan the audience and you can tell who's Native and who's not by like just in the audience, and they scan them and they tell a joke, and that's what I'm talking about. You see who laughs and who's like awkwardly sitting there. Like, I don't understand if I'm supposed to laugh at this or not laugh at this. But I really like this clip because really explain why I have dark humor or why I laugh at certain things that other people might not laugh at. Anyway, what were y'all's reactions? Sorry.
I think kind of anyone who might have gone under hardships, like, might get a dark sense of humor. And of course, when like that hardship is cultural, I think that, you know, that there's also, like, I would say sometimes Black people also have a dark sense of humor. Like, there was one comedian I saw with my parents where like half his set was talking about how his mom's boyfriends would physically abuse him, which doesn't sound funny, but somehow he made it funny about like how his mom's boyfriends would like try to prove that they were a father figure and like, you know, be like, shut up, and like, you know. So yeah, I definitely think it's like similar. Also, like, some like religious minority groups in Pakistan have the dankest, darkest memes, which I think it's like kind of a similar thing that I've noticed, where it's like going through hardship creates a dark sense of humor to try to like deal with the complexities of everyday life.
Well, and I think it ties in really well with some of our past conversations around, like, you know, mental health and like drug, like issues of addiction. Like, and something like humor is free, right? Like when you're like living in like and going through like oppressive situations, traumatic situations, like, you know, one of the few things that you have that you can to use as a coping mechanism is, you know, is humor. And I feel like that's probably the common thread for why, you know, certain groups of people have been able to really like thrive within comedy and use those stories. Like, I know Tiffany Haddish is another person who has like a really like dark, like messed up, like upbringing. And like, even hearing her like just matter of factly tell you her life, and you would think she's telling a joke, but it's not a joke. And I think a lot of, you know, like my favorite comedians have that sort of quality to them. Even thinking back to our last conversation around like drug addiction, and that part of the documentary that we watched that showed Richard Pryor talking about, you know, setting himself on fire by doing drugs. Like, that's like crazy, like dark.
Yeah. And he was making jokes about it. He was like, I've seen the jokes that you made, like, and like lit a match and was like, this is Richard Pryor walking down the street. That was funny. Like, it was like, it's hard for me not to laugh, even though he shouldn't. Like, I don't think it's funny that he like got set on fire, but that framing of the joke is funny.
Talking about drugs, I think Brandee, you and I have talked about this. And the question if it is funny, like my sister sent me a meme once of a woman like sweeping the sidewalk and like mopping it. I think it was like sweeping or mopping. And then the term up there was like something about her being on meth. And when I got that, I laughed my ass off. And then also we've made jokes in the family like, oh, that person's relapsed because they're stripping their floors and putting in, like, they're updating their house. So you like look in the window and you're like, oh, there they go. They just relapsed. Because it's like, do you laugh at this? And do you make fun of people who are on drugs because you see the impossible situation? Like, I don't know about you, but when you see someone on meth, you know, most of the times it's a death sentence, right? So like, how do you deal with like this as a society where everyone in your family and in your neighborhood is hooked on drugs, and like you've seen the consequence of that?
Yeah.
What do you do?
That's a really good question. I think Kendra and I, we started to touch on this like after our conversation a couple weeks ago, but that's something that I really had to think about with the Chappelle show, actually. So he has a bit character that's like a recurring bit that he does where the character is a crackhead. And for me, it was like I love like all of Dave Chappelle stuff, but this is like the one like skit, like I can't, like this character, I can't stomach it. Like this is one like scene where I think like he wins the lottery and like he buys like a huge crack rock, and so like it's this character, and of course he has like, I don't know, like he's ashy lips, and like he's like scratching at his neck, and like it's just like a real like stereotypical like just like dehumanizing portrayal of someone who's an addict. And like especially the scene with this huge like crack rock, and him like hugging it and be like, yeah, man, like I'm gonna be done with this in a couple of hours. And like, I know what it's like for my mom to like spend all the money. Like she didn't want to spend all the money, but like she couldn't help herself. Like, that's not funny. And I remember one time watching this as my mom was like literally like on a bender and not knowing where she was and being like crying as I'm watching this. Like, this is not funny. Like, my mom's not a crackhead. Like, I don't like. So I completely can I can relate to like not liking.
So that goes back to like the audience, right?
Addicts.
Like that goes back to the audience when we talk about humor being healing or being harmful. I think it depends on who's saying it and who's listening to it. So humor can be the ultimate healing tool for a people or for an individual as a way of like moving forward. But I think people have to be in a particular place to be able to accept that humor. That's where you have to be coming from the same place, right? This is where we're talking about who's the audience, who are you having those jokes with, maybe.
I don't even necessarily think you have to have the exact lived experience, but I do think it's incumbent upon you to at least do your research before you start dabbling in topics and get feedback from people who have an insight so that you know whether or not you're on point. And I think that goes for whether you're in the in-group or not. I mean, I feel like you're more likely to be on point if you're in the in-group, but some things it's like, all right, that might be funny for us. Well, that's for us. Like, mixed, we don't want to put this out and like have this in mixed company kind of thing. And so yeah, like there are just certain things, certain topics that should be handled with care. I look at people, a comedian like Chris Rock, like he does a lot of political humor and racial humor, but I know he also early in his career like played a crack addict. So like I've never seen him like I think in having that experience, perhaps like he has more of a like he played that character with such like care that I would expect that he would do better than like how Dave Chappelle handled that, because like he was able to bring humanity to that situation in a way that I think the crackhead character wasn't meant to bring awareness about like any of the stuff that we talked about, last week. It wasn't done to like, it wasn't even like necessarily racial humor in the way that like the Clayton Bigsby or the other ones. It's like, who are you making fun of? Poor Black people.
Yeah.
Like, people who are suffering. And so for me, it's like, who has the right? I don't think he had the right in that circumstance, in that situation.
Do you think that some of that depends on personality? Because do you sometimes see like in your own personal life, like where a situation will happen and one person's laughing about it and the other person's like, that wasn't funny. Like,
people deal with trauma differently, but I do think that you can name things they're like exclusively traumatic, and maybe like we can like take a step, but I think like there is no humor in someone like falling back into addiction. I think you can definitely like find the humor in it, like if the circumstance allows, but like it's sad. It's a sad
rape jokes, child molestation jokes, murder jokes,
dead baby jokes.
I mean, look, I'm with you. I can't stand that dead baby genre. I don't like the Nazi jokes. I think there needs to be some lines in society so that there's a modicum of respect. And I think it frees us to laugh at other things that allow the conversation to move forward in a healing way, because there are some lines where certain things are off limits.
Yeah. I guess it's that question of, if you're telling a joke at the expense of somebody else, is that okay? Right? Because you're going back to that, like dehumanizing another person and you're laughing at that about them. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's fine to make a joke about dehumanizing someone if that person is like Dick Cheney, but like, mom going through relapse probably does not have a modicum of that same power.
Now the flip of that is, I've heard sitting in NA meetings, I've heard addicts like, or people like tell their stories, and it's a riot. Like, it's because they're telling their life story and they're able, to like frame it in a way that they were able to like, like, yeah. And I stole the TV, but I couldn't get it out the house. And, like, just like crazy like crackhead shit. Like, like, and, like that's different. Like, you've had that life experience and it's like, laugh with me, kind of thing. But sorry, Kendra, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh no, that's all I had. And I think also someone telling their own story gives it more of an opportunity to like laugh with that person instead of like at them. Like, yeah, there are a lot of comedians who will tell stories about like, you know, the darkest hour, like something like hard that they went through, something traumatic, but they somehow managed to make it funny. I think the importance is like, you know, making sure it's about, you know, making sure it's like, if you're telling that story, it is about you and not about like, you know, someone else. And like, you know, it's not making fun of a lot of people who could be affected. Like, yeah, if you're going to tell a joke where the punchline is like someone was raped and that's the funny part, then yeah, that's going to alienate like at least 1 out of 3 women in the audience, right?
Yeah.
If you tell a joke that's like rapists suck and here's why, then that's going to get more people on board.
So that brings up a question that we were talking about, which is it okay to make fun of people who are in power, like white men or white culture, right? So we're talking, half of our conversation right now has been about how it's not okay to talk about those that have been subjugated in society. But is it okay to do the talk about the oppressors? And is that kind of, and I think another underlying factor that we've been seeing is like people of color's ability to connect with each other on a joke because they're making fun of do we want to talk about that topic?
No, I like that topic.
Excellent question.
Yeah.
Personally, and I think okay, so before we jump in, just to complicate it a little bit, like thinking about a movie like White Chicks, where you have like it's racial satire, but it's like aimed at making fun of white people. And so like that movie is problematic for a number of reasons. But like I've been seeing like recently, like people like going back and watching it and giving like 2020 takes on it. And
I watched it recently. It's bad, but not because it's making fun of white people, just because it's just not.
It's bad. It's bad. But yeah, no, I think it's completely different. Like I think white people, because they still hold so much power in society, it doesn't have the same and they should give up some of that power and like in hopefully in the effort of like calling out the absurdity of the power of these power imbalances and all these things, like it can help people to be more conscious. So I think it's necessary and good.
Okay, so I'll take the other side of it just to take it. I think that all of these things that we've been talking about, the sensitivity to the audience that you're talking to, who's listening to it, like it really, in an ideal world, it should apply to all of us, right? In an ideal world, we're not making fun of each other, regardless of whether you're the one in the power position or the one who's in the perceived weaker position. Because if you really want to, we shall not judge anyone. Like, who knows what the person in the power position is thinking? Are they happy to be there? Did they get forced there? Are they also a victim of circumstance? Who knows what other things they've got in their life? So
yeah, but it's not an individual person. You're not making fun of an individual person.
I get it, but like if you're in a room, right? If we're talking, like if you're in a room and someone's making a joke or a comedian is saying it, and there's people of mixed company, maybe in an ideal world, we could one day hope to get to a place where we're not making fun of each other in that way, and we could kind of look at everybody from a point of like authenticity and appreciation rather than appropriation. With that said, I do think that comedy is a way of discourse, and it's a way of conversation, and it's a way of like being able to get us to the next place and evolve us to the next point. So I do think that comedy is a valid form of discussion and debate, even though I do think we should be careful.
So sorry, that clip, Brandee, with the native stuff, I stopped you, but it goes on briefly afterwards, and it talks about if we can't laugh about racism and we can't laugh at racism, then what? Then we can't talk about it. But I mean, it's about talking. Like, why? I don't know. You have to talk about those that are oppressing you, because if you don't,
well, yeah, and I think that's the difference. The difference in like in a lot of this humor, and I think that's part of it's the difference between good and bad humor. Like, is it? And for me, like, I like, I can laugh at some lowbrow stuff, whatever. But like, I think the more successful entertainers like can like tell a more complicated joke than sort of like the basis kinds of just tired, like you said, Kendra, just tired jokes that we've seen, we've heard, they've been done. But when you can actually do it in a way that, one, like you're making fun of the concept of white people, right? Like, or maybe you're making fun of like a specific white person for something they did. It's meant to take them down a peg because they've been problematic, not just because they're white. Like, I think like those kinds of jokes, like, oh, white people are like this and black people are like that. Yeah, like, those are boring. Old, we're tired.
Like, and there's something about when you're in a state of position of power, you do have an added responsibility of your role in that position of power. And you do need to like, knock someone down and make them humble so they remember what they're saying. So they take a second chance at who they are and how they're behaving. So it is a very different perspective.
Yeah.
That allows for that humor to.
What did you guys think about the Bill Burr stand up? So in this particular piece, he got a lot of backlash from white women in particular because of his, obviously the use of the word bitch. So he referred to white women as white bitches, but like the point of his whole like diatribe was to talk about how white women have been complicit in racism. And I think, that whole thing sort of got lost with the backlash against, him using the word bitch. And there's a whole conversation around like who even has the right to, use the B word or the N word. And is it something that, only if you're in that group, which I can get on board with to a point. I think the B word, I don't know if we as women agreed on that, that like only we're allowed to say it. But what did you guys think about that? Like, did you think that he was, being too edgy? Did you think that there was a different way he could have framed it that would have alienated less people? Or do you think that it was like just right because it hit the people who he was trying to hit and make them think about things he wanted them to think about?
He was talking about basically Karens. Right. Yeah. He just explicitly came out with who a Karen is.
And he also, if I remember right, he was also like, he wasn't saying like, oh, like Karens are annoying, but white men are fine. He was like, no, you should also get scolded at along with me. Just because you're a woman doesn't make you too much different from me when it comes to racism because we're both white, right?
The most backlash I've gotten in a workplace or in any circumstances with me coming up as like a person of color, the greatest resistance I've found is actually white women.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah.
And they like, I try to identify with them as a woman, but sometimes it just goes over their head and they don't take your side. You're just kind of like, hey, can you take my side and go up against this like
patriarchy,
paternalism, patriarchy, and then they kind of leave you hanging.
Yeah,
that's honestly my experience, and it's happened several times. So,
well, that's a lot of what Black feminists critique of the women's liberation movement was that a lot of white feminists were like only concerned about their issues and didn't care about the issues that were impacting Black women and women of color, and that kind of caused there to be a break. And I think that's something that we're still sort of grappling with. And then Black men seizing on that and being like, if you're a Black feminist or if you're a Black woman who considers herself a feminist, like, oh, that's that white women stuff, and they've like brainwashed you into like being against the Black man.
It's just like, honestly, so I saw it. I didn't think it was like wild or groundbreaking. The funniest part about that monologue to me was how obvious it was that Bill Burr has a Black wife. Like, Bill Burr's Black wife sat him down and was like, honey, think about this. Or like sat him down. She scolded him about something. And then like 3 years later, when he like kind of got over it and like kind of like thought about it, he wrote this monologue. Like, I don't think if Bill Burr did not have a Black wife, I do not think he would have written that monologue, honestly.
I thought the monologue was great. It was hysterical. And I love the part about how did Black History Month end up being in February? It should have been in June when the weather is much nicer and you've got a couple more days. I just thought it was hilarious.
I think that, okay, so if he kind of like not said bitch, right? But he said something like, okay, so we saw the meme earlier where it says dancing with Karens, right?
Now people are saying Karen is a racial slur when actually Karen was Dane Cook, when he started, he had a joke like a long time ago about Karen, and it was not in a racialized context at all. But now it's become a racialized term. But I've heard white women say like that's a slur. Like, do you agree with that?
Those white women are just being annoying for no reason. It's a slur. Like when has someone punched you in the face after calling you a Karen? Like you're just mad that your feelings are hurt and that someone called you out for your racism and you're going to complain about it to your friends at brunch. Like that's not actual oppression though. Sorry, Karen.
So here's the thing though. I do agree with you 100%. But at the end of the day, you're calling someone a name, right? And maybe it doesn't apply to that particular person. But
my grandpa makes fun of Karens all the time. Like if you sit down with him, he will just go on and on and on. And then he'll point out all the bullshit, like the systematic examples of what this represents, right? So you're giving a name to a phenomenon that has occurred over and over and over and over. It's systematic. So you have to use a term for it. What do you say? Like, tell me, what makes you feel comfortable when we talk about the fact that, you know, a large group of white women have been complicit in racism and they continue to do so. They continue to be a part of the problem. And yet they say, you got to give us a pass because we're women. Like, do you give a woman a pass? Like, do you think it's okay that this woman in Central Park calls a police, says that this man is trying to kill me, even though he's bird watching, and basically tells her, you know, you can't have your dog here. She says, I'm going to do this when she knows the consequence of that is the police are going to come and shoot this man. Like she's conscious. What boys?
Who raised the guys? Who raised those boys who became men, who became racist? It's the women who were raising them. So the women can't not have any responsibility.
Kyle Rittenhouse's mama drove him.
Like who raised these people, right? So I think the women there also have to take responsibility for the sons that they rose to be men.
The guy that's a part of the white national movement, I can't remember his name, like Nathan, this younger dude, like I think he's a millennial or early.
Wait, Nate Fuentes? Is that? Yes, no, I thought that was Nick.
The guy, I don't know what his name. His mother lives in Whitefish, Montana, which is about 45 minutes from where my family lives. And so when the BLM, like when the movement started this last summer, they went and staked out her house and protested her house. Is that right or wrong?
I'm fine with that.
I'm fine with that too. But
yeah,
the police came after them.
Absolutely.
The police came after them though and was like trying to break them up, and they're like, we're being peaceful. We got a permit here. And then the police came and then there was a video of this man coming up in their face, screaming at them. The police go and grab the guy and they're joking with him.
Yeah, but then I also wonder, especially thinking about like what happened in 2016 with Hillary Clinton. It's like, it's difficult because like white women are definitely in an empowered position and they have a lot of privilege, but then like they are still like oppressed as women. And so I am sensitive to the critiques of anything that just like invalidates a woman just because she is a woman kind of thing. Yeah. So in some instances, like I think it comes up when people just like throw the term around and it's not being applied. Like now we decided like this has a very specific meaning. Like you're actively trying to endanger a person of color's life because of your like need to control situations that aren't your business, or at least that's my definition for a Karen. But I can see how like white people can take on the language of like social justice language to weaponize it against people who are trying to hold people accountable and be better, if that makes sense. So like now, like social justice warrior is a like it's a bad or like used to like make fun. And I could see, even like people now think perverting the concept of Karen into just like, you know, dismiss white women, even in circumstances where they're not being like what we think of as Karen. So I think
like when white men use the term Karen, it's like, you're a Chris. Like,
so
what?
Exactly. I think that like the monologue though, I don't think he was just putting down a Karen or like somebody who's acting in this way where they like called the police on this guy, you know, because he's black in an area. But he's talking about co-opting. So,
absolutely,
like white women are co-opting the space of social justice instead of being a partner and ally. They're like, oh, this is ours too.
Yeah,
that's different. Actually, what impacted me most and what I learned most from talking to everyone here was this idea of the power dynamics, especially like the power of accents and the power of like black accents. I didn't realize how impactful that is really in general culture. And then also just hearing about how us coming to the conclusion that if we're subjugating another person or being inauthentic, we have to be really cognizant of that. And I think every time there's a moment where we can be cognizant of I'm switching, right? Am I switching on the behalf of other people? I think that also there's a right to make fun of those that are in power. As somebody who's subjugated, we can make fun of. I think so.
That's all we can do. We don't really have a lot of power otherwise.
No,
so
we don't.
like,
and I think that if, you know, there's a lot of similarities between cultures, ethnicities, and people of color that are subjugated by white culture, especially men.
Absolutely.
I would say like my takeaway is that humor can be used, is a very powerful tool, and it can be used to advance discussion and conversation, but it can also be used in a negative way. And I think to any comedians and writers that are out there, like think about, you know, Kendra has said this repeatedly, like think about, can your joke stand without it? And if you are making the joke that has some kind of racial overtone to it, is it advancing the conversation? Is it like getting people to think? And I think that's just incredible, because people who have that ability to write in a humorous way, I think they're brilliant minds, and I think they hold a lot of power. And if they just know that, maybe they can use it for good.
I love that. That was so good. I'm like, I can't follow that. Like what Haleh said. So you guys can take it.
My final thought is what everyone said here. Also, please hire me to do comedy for whatever you may have.
Absolutely.
You can email me on my website, which is my first name and my last name.com. I am funny, according to people, and I'm also smart. So yeah, just let me know. Hire me. I do virtual shows.
Hey. Thank you, everyone, for coming to another White Man's Podcast. Thanks for listening. We hope you learned anything. Please engage with us in a conversation in the comments below. Be nice, trolls. Let's take a step back. And then where can we find our podcast also, Kendra?
So you could find us wherever podcasts are found. That includes Spotify, Amazon, Apple, and YouTube. You can also subscribe on Spotify. Follow us there so that you get updates whenever we release a new episode. But thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Bye. Bye.